The original story of Turok is a Native American guy who makes a wrong turn in the wilderness and somehow ends up in this lost land that is a primeval, violent, intense, savage place, populated by dinosaurs and Neanderthals and volcanoes. We knew that we were revisiting a character that has meant a lot to a lot of people over the years. We're mining a very rich vein of story material by hewing closely to the original story of Turok.
The golden age of comic books was considered 1938 with the first appearance of Superman through and beyond the end of World War II. Around the time of the end of World War II, superheroes were dying out. The fan base wasn't there as much. The Nazis weren't around to fight anymore. And the entire comic book industry began looking for new genres, new things that could fire up the imagination of their readers, which had predominantly been 8 to 12-year-old boys and servicemen.
The other problem they had was television, which was catching on. It was in everybody's home. It was siphoning off a certain amount of the audience, and publishers were very unsure what it meant to them. They were afraid it was going to destroy the entire industry because kids would be getting stories for free on TV and they wouldn't be buying comics.
They started to look to westerns, horror, science fiction, things that kids in the late 40s, 1950s were really into.
And you had a lot of strange things going on in this country in the 50s. What with the Korean War, what with the Red Scare. So comic books were reflecting the fact that the public was scared a lot and they were paranoid about a lot of things. There was this whole movement that was very paranoid about the idea that comic books were maybe causing juvenile delinquency.
National attention was turned to the comic book in the mid-1950s. There were comic book burnings that were actually taking place in different towns in the 1950s. It was pretty severe. As a result, the comic book industry banded together, realizing that if they didn't create a self-censorship board, the feds were going to come in and censor them for them. The Comics Code Authority came about in the mid-1950s. It was a very, very stringent self-censorship board created by the comic book industry. And it was within this backdrop that Gaylord Dubois wrote and co-created Turok, Son of Stone for Dell Comics.
Gaylord Dubois wrote the first 7 or 8 issues of Turok. There exists in an archive somewhere a manuscript that he wrote for the first issue, which he called Young Hawk. In the first script, he intended the lead character to be a little younger than Turok wound up being. It is not known whether he renamed the character and made him older or if the editors at Western Publishing did, but at some point Young Hawk turned into the first issue of Turok.
Working with artist Rex Maxon, who was a Tarzan newspaper comic strip artist, they created this character and he made his debut in Dell's 4-color comic books number 596 in December of 1954.
Turok was quite different from comics at the time because somebody there had figured out that kids like dinosaurs. We know that now, but in 1954, when they did the first stories, there weren't a lot of dinosaur comics out.
The idea of a lost valley where dinosaurs still exist was very, very intriguing to Dubois and to Maxon and to the powers that be at Dell. After all, if you look at literature, from the works of Edgar Rice Burroughs to movies, there were so many great lost valleys and lost kingdoms where dinosaurs could still live. So taking Native American characters and incorporating them into this tale of man versus dinosaurs was something that everyone felt was a very good, marketable concept for 1954. And they were right.
And after that, there were a lot of dinosaurs on comic book covers.
A million years ago, when I was a child, there used to go to the barber shop, not stylist, and there would be, a stack of magazines, and if you were lucky, comics. And that's where I recall reading my first Turok comic books. And they were huge concept comics in that, the general thing of Indians, lost in a canyon they couldn't get out of, or did they go back in time? It was never quite clear, as I recall. And there's these big freaking dinosaurs. What was not to like, and they could kill them with a bow and arrow as long as they dipped it into the berries of a certain poisonous plant. And, they did huge things like not only did they kill dinosaurs, they skinned them and made boots out of their scales and walked across burning lava.
It's the first comic book that I ever read in my life. I think I saw it when I was about 5 in a supermarket in Puerto Rico when I was a kid, and picked it up because it had dinosaurs and it had Indians and, two things that were an instant sell to me. But once I had the comic and read it, the thing that really appealed to me was this father-son relationship between the older Turok and young Andar. It was nice for me as a young reader to envision myself as Andar and having that protective figure of Turok there and being able to see and do all these cool things. Now, as I'm a parent now and grown up, and I really identify with the Turok side of it.
Andar, what are you doing? I ruined everything. Listen to me, Andar. Your father's strength is in you. So is mine. We will get out of here.
Soon the creative team changed at Dell Comics on Turok, Son of Stone. From Gaylord Dubois, Paul Newman took over the writing. The Paul Newman who had written prolifically for so many different comic book companies. The artistic reins went from Rex Maxon over to Alberto Gialetti, who was one of the most talented artists on the comic book scene in the 50s and 60s.
Paul S. Newman and Alberto Gialetti did all these issues, and it was consistent, and these guys understood their characters and could take them in proper directions and develop them.
But Turok, in that period of time, was still a comic book that was quite bland in terms of action. By the time Turok was brought back in the 1980s in the pages of Valiant Comics, it had a very, very different tone to it. You can't simply bring a character back exactly the way he or she was.
The problem was, by the time Turok came into the Valiant universe, the cast of characters we had created and the world that they inhabited, we already had 10, 15 titles, and all of them were interlocked, story-wise and continuity-wise. So it's just we couldn't really interject this concept of, okay, now there's this place though he goes and back in the past, and now he's in dinosaur land, and him and Andar are fighting dinosaurs. We had to figure out a way to inculcate it into our universe, so that the other characters there the other players could interact with them.
In the 80s and 90s, the level of intensity in comic books had changed rapidly and strongly. There was a lot of action. There was a lot of kinetic energy in those comic books. And Turok really took on the dinosaurs front and center.
We got him out of the past into the Lost Land, which is this interdimensional thing, and then when that was over, we moved him into the present day, kind of logically. So he wound up in South America somewhere. But unfortunately, a lot of the dinosaurs came with him.
And so Turok had this bow that was like a cybernetic bow with explosive arrows, and any technology that he encountered, night vision goggles and stuff, he would take that on. Just because he was from the 1840s or whenever he was from, that didn't mean that he wasn't smart enough to take advantage of everything that he came across, which I thought was a really positive thing about him. And so he went around hunting bionic dinosaurs with computer minds, so they were that much more dangerous. And we had a lot of success with that.
Turok #1 was the best-selling comic Valiant ever did, sold 1.7 million copies. In 94 or 95, I believe, that Acclaim purchased Valiant Comics. We became Acclaim Comics at that point. Of course, Acclaim's mandate was to come in and take these properties because they wanted a house where they could develop properties for video games. So Turok was one of the first things that really appealed to them, which turned out to be their best-selling game of all time. And I think that's one of the things that helped keep Turok in the public mind.
For our production, we wanted to do a proper reimagining of Turok for the 21st century. And it had to be a reimagining that respected the character of Turok and Andar, respected the backstory of Turok and Andar, but expanded it, made it more real, made it more relevant, made it maybe a bit more respectful of Native American culture as well. And that became very, very important to this Turok in this day and age.
what we asked ourselves was, why should this character go to this place? You know, what's the opportunity for us in sending Turok, this Native American guy, into this savage landscape? And what we realized was, in the tradition of all great mythic storytelling, where a character goes on an adventure becomes a crucible to boil him down and break him down and reduce him to his essence and have him discover who he is at his core. Tony Bedard gave us a phenomenal screenplay. Tony is a guy who has shepherded Turok in the past. He wrote and edited the Turok comics during the Valiant Comics era.
Writing comics is slightly different than writing a movie because I'd say that a comic is more like a sketch and a movie is more like an oil painting. You have to really rework and spend time with the movie storyline and make sure that everything is just so. We all talked about, in general, what we thought would be appropriate for the movie in very general terms. One of the first things that I told them was that it would be great to go back to the roots of it, to call it Turok, Son of Stone, and to focus on that relationship with Andar and not have all the other distractions of robots and lasers and things like that.
You will be safer here.
No, I'm going with you.
The biggest difference between our Turok and the Turok in the comic or games or whatever is that it's a story of Turok the man, not his fight against dinosaurs.
Turok he's a loner. Since he is young, he's always had this instinct to kill, but also he was very good at protecting himself. If you have come to ask again, my answer is the same.
And through the course of the movie, rather than becoming reformed, it's actually an embracing of that darkness and ending up in a world where that makes sense. A world of, monsters that are bigger than the monster he felt that he was. Evan's vision of the movie was not a simple warrior versus dinosaur picture. He said, I want to make this more important. Now, there's a lot of ways of doing that, and the way he chose was exploring that warrior and giving him a grudge against civilization, actually, more than any specific character.
I only want to know why you are here alone in the dark.
It is where I belong.
And you say I am hiding.
The villain of the piece, Cheechak, is really not that different from Turok.
The beauty about Cheechak is that he not only feels justified for stepping in his way, he's out for blood. He's out for vengeance because he wants this guy and everyone in his tribe, his nation, his family, dead, decimated, because his father was killed years ago.
For years, I dreamed of finding this tomahawk. You must have stolen it when you ambushed my father like a coward, am I right? Do you remember? It happened where I killed your chief.
He was my brother!
I mean, Turok is saying, you killed my brother, and Cheechak's saying, hey, you killed my father. What separates them is how they deal with that, where Cheechak is just this evil guy who has no respect, for life in any way.
He's your epitome of someone who just wants to create havoc and hurt people.
You think you have won? Take a look behind you!
His intentions are cruel.
I will kill you, Turok! I will kill all of you!
Turok, it can be said, has such respect for life. He has turned his back on it because he fears this animal inside him that has come out that we saw in the early flashback. So it's, two sides of the same darkness. The idea of portraying Turok's rage as something special when we see him as a young man came from a discussion of, slow motion, multiple effects, and we ended up with the idea of whiting out the background to give it a sense of lyricism or unreality, really.
Our goal was to really grip the audience and make every emotional beat ring true. And the emotional material that's on the table is very powerful stuff.
We all talked about who were we going to make this movie for, and we thought that an older audience than one might expect.
Next your son, and then your wife.
The nature of the material is darker when you really, want to approach it a little more realistically. And we had discussions about this. We could, do you want to show the shadow on the wall, or do you want to show the axe in the chest? There are times where we show the shadow on the wall because falling intestines, hard to animate, a lot of detail there. Cutting off a hand, letting it fly through the air, we can handle that.
When it comes to the violence in Turok, I personally don't have a problem with it. First of all, it's fantasy, it's comic book, it's pulp fiction. But secondly, there is violence in Native American history. Perhaps not for every tribe. There are some tribes that are more fishermen or artisans, and maybe they're in rural locations. But this particular tribe that this is loosely based on, I spoke to the tribal scholar, and he said, we're absolutely proud of our history. We were warriors, and when we were looking at the weaponry and talking about their history, he made it very clear that this particular tribe was very violent and did have the warrior spirit in their history.
Once we had put together the story, we gave it to Valerie to look over and get her feedback. And I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I'm thinking that we got the tone of it pretty well.
We looked at everything to make sure, more visual than anything. Were the weapons accurate? Would that tribe have used those weapons? And very specific things like in their warrior society, they used long bows and not as much of the short bows and arrows that you see a lot in the old-fashioned westerns that we grew up with. Staffs with the feathers, and we looked at the hairpiece, and we looked at the clothing, and a lot of it was very accurate, and they made some changes according to our comments.
For the actual individual artist, we hired people who were professional, and they got to just dive in and do what they wanted. So I would talk to a background person, well, here's the location, here's the time of day, and as long as it looked something like that, that's what went through for Evan's okay. So as opposed to me having an idea and putting it on the artists were able to say, well, I think this is what a Lost Land would look like. The amazing thing was what Lotus Studios did overseas. When we got the animation back of the Carnotaurus, and it's thinking, and it's looking at the log and kind of saying, never walked over a log before, I'll give it a try, kind of thing. It's just an incredible creature, and that was not a simplified design. That was, we put a lot of extra texture to it in terms of design to make it stand out from something you'd see on a kid's show.
Our composer, James Venable, created a score that made our world feel so much bigger.
One of the things that was kind of unique to this picture is we came up with themes that work with each different character. We also came up with a theme for the location or the kind of place where Turok spends a lot of his time called the Lost World. And there's a Lost World theme in this movie. It goes kind of like this. So that is the Lost World theme. Now I'm going to show you kind of what it sounds like in context with the movie. This is actually the portion of the film where they're first going into the Lost World.
Sneak herd. I don't think those are buffalo. Where are we?
It's amazing how music can take a visual, even the simplest visual, and make it fuller and bigger and richer.
I felt like the visuals really had so much going for them as far as the scale. We have dinosaurs, obviously big, and then also there's a lot of scenes that were huge, so I wanted to try to bring the music to that grand scale as well. I was really blown away by this movie because of how kind of daring they were with going all the way with, if it was really good stuff happening, they went all the way. If it was bad stuff happening, they went all the way. And that was really fun for me because I really am, musically I'm about taking things over the top and being larger than life, and I felt like this was a really great match for me because this movie really went over the top.
It's my hope that the Native American adult community that watches this, the non-children, will enjoy this for what it is and enjoy the fact that there was detail taken to make sure that the Native American portrayal in terms of the weaponry and the costuming was accurate. I think they will enjoy it.
Our hope for Turok is that it will go everywhere that the most exciting comic book based franchises go.
You always want to give them what they want, but not how they expect it. That's the old saw that every writer, I think, tries to adhere to. And so I'm hoping that people are a bit surprised and maybe even shocked by what they see. And at the same time, it's, I think, very energizing and engaging. I'm really proud of how the movie turned out.
We have to make Turok relevant for today's audiences, but yet respectful of the old guys out there like me who have grown up with Turok since as early as the 1950s.
I don't think that any one type of fan will like the picture any more than a person who loved the comic would like the video game. But they all tap into this essence of basically one guy against a world, a dangerous world, and coming out on top.
Strong. Because we are many.